Hello. Today has been pretty awful. Well, in terms of the weather anyway. It's rained heavily all morning, and this afternoon it's still quite dull. Grey cloud covers the sky. There is a fairly weak sun trying to poke its way through that cloud, but to be honest, it's not making that much of an effort. So, join me on this video where I talk about shooting landscape photos on a day such as this. I completely forgot to mention this on the day. What a banana. The reason I shoot in woodland on overcast days is that the light is much softer, colours tend to be a bit more saturated, and it's great for shooting things like details, leaves, fungi, that sort of thing. Woodland on brighter days tends to be a bit more contrasty, which I think doesn't suit it quite as well. And I'm going to have a walk down here and see what I can find. There are some things to consider when shooting on a dull day like today in woodland. For one thing, the light levels in here are very low. The foliage above my head is obviously blocking a lot of the light from the sky above. So typically, that means thinking about one of three things. Either using a large aperture, using a slow shutter speed, or using a high ISO. Which of these three is important will largely depend on the subject that you're shooting. So for instance, is your subject moving? In which case you need to think about shutter speed. Do you use a fast shutter speed to freeze that movement? Or could you use a longer shutter speed and let the movement blur out and become softer and more ethereal? Then there's depth of field. Do you need sort of pin sharp from foreground to background? In which case you'd use a small aperture. Or, with a bit of careful focusing, could you focus precisely on your subject, use a large aperture, and just anything else in the scene either get very soft or even blur out completely depending on the lens that you're using. And then finally, to use a high ISO, and that allows you to then use a combination of a fast shutter speed and a small aperture, but which will result in noise. This isn't quite the disaster that it may have been sort of 10 years ago. Modern sensors are very, very good at suppressing noise, and also it can be dealt with in post-production, in Lightroom or similar. But also noise can be aesthetically quite pleasing in its own way. The lens that you shoot with will have an influence on how easy it is to shoot in dim and dark lighting in woodland. Prime lenses are great because they typically have large maximum apertures, so require less compromise in terms of shutter speed and ISO. That said, telephotos, although they may have a smaller maximum aperture, do allow you more flexibility in terms of composition, particularly if you can't get close to your subject, which quite often happens in woodland. There's lots of things on the woodland floor here, logs and branches and smaller trees, so I might not physically be able to get to the subject that interests me. So a telephoto in this situation, even though it may be compromised in terms of the aperture, may still be the better option. So, the most controversial subject of all, handheld or tripod. Now, I do like tripods and I use them a lot, largely because I shoot at either dawn or dusk when light levels are naturally low. But for woodland, I actually prefer to shoot handheld. I find that much more intuitive and spontaneous. With a tripod, it does involve getting the thing set up, getting the height right, getting the legs the right length, all that palaver. But I've left this video till quite late in the day, and I'm still getting used to shooting YouTube videos. And I think one lesson I've learned so far is start recording earlier in the day, particularly in wintertime. So I think I'm going to have to shoot with a tripod because of the light levels. So I'm going to start exploring now. So join me in a few seconds and we'll actually start shooting something, which is always going to be the fun part, isn't it? I've got a shot set up and I'm now faced with one of those compromises I mentioned before. I'll show you the shot that I have in mind on the back of the camera. And the scene itself. And because it is so dim and dark now, there's a risk that the main leaf, the one that I want to be pin sharp, is going to be unsharp because of the shutter speed that I use. I've got the camera set to f4. This is an f4 lens, that's the maximum aperture of this lens. I've cranked up the ISO. I don't want to go too high, but I'm going to try and maximize the shutter speed in order to freeze that movement. There is a slight breeze, which is sort of ebbing and flowing, so I'm going to wait for the right moment, see when the leaf is at its steadiest, and then shoot then. If it works though, I'll pop it on screen after this with the exposure details, so you can see for yourself the compromises and the exposure that I ultimately used. I do find shooting in woodland quite tricky at times, I must admit, largely because it's such a chaotic environment. It can be quite tricky to create a composition that is interesting but isn't so full of detail that you don't know where to look within the image space. So for that reason, I quite often use a telephoto, which allows me to zoom in on details that interest me and so exclude anything that I think isn't going to or doesn't need to be in the picture and may actually detract from it. Now, a fellow landscape photographer, Jason Friend, does tease me about this, it must be said, in all in good spirits, of course. And we did shoot a video not too long ago together using telephotos in woodland. I'll put a link in the description below so you can go and watch that. But yeah, so I've used a telephoto for this shot, and I'll just show you what I have in mind. I'll take you off the tripod very carefully. Oh, just as the camera shuts down. Isn't that just typical? So for this shot, I have used the maximum aperture, so f4, it's an f4 lens. I focused on the foliage at the front of the shot. That means that the trunks in the background, the trees in the background, are going to be out of focus. But I actually quite like that. I think that gives me a nice simple background, which helps the foliage in the foreground stand out more. So I'm going to take the shot. If it works, I shall, of course, pop it on screen. I'll add the exposure details as well, so you can see how I shot it. And then I'm going to go and find a few more shots before the light completely goes. I have a shot set up, one that proves that I don't necessarily need to use a telephoto lens and can shoot horizontal images. And I don't know whether you can hear, but there are lots of jackdaws around. It's heading home time for them, I think, so they're gathering before flying off to their roost, which is quite a nice sound. So this shot's very simple. I found a little cluster of beech leaves. I'm shooting wide open, so f2.8. This is an f2.8 lens. It's my 12 to 40mm lens. I'll show you what I have in mind. I'll just take you off the tripod there. So that's the shot I have in mind. And that's the tree itself. So again, I'm using very, very careful focusing, which is getting quite tricky now because it is quite dim. And I'm focusing on the front of the leaf using focus peaking, manual focusing, focus peaking. I'll take that shot. If that works, I'll pop it on screen after this with the exposure details so you can see what it looks like. I'll find one more location and then, yeah, I think then it'll be too dark to do anything more. Well, it's actually so dark now that I've had to dig my torch out and pop that on for a bit of illumination. Oh, I think that's an owl and a blackbird, possibly. I'm going to take one final shot, and this time I've been mainly using high ISO in order to freeze movement, but I'm going to go back down to the base ISO of the camera
it's quite a dim, dark scene now, but I'm just going to let the camera exposure be what it is. So whatever, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. So I'm just going to use a long exposure just to create the image. If that works, I'll pop that on screen after this. But otherwise, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found it interesting. And please do share, like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time somewhere in Northumberland for the next one. See you then. Goodbye.